I want to discuss some of the work you are doing because
Sure.
you wrote this paper in, I believe, last year on multi-part payments, and maybe we can start the conversation off with a discussion about what multi-part payments are and why they're important.
Yes. So I basically published 2 papers last year. The one I actually wrote the year before, but I only published it last year, which was what I always say a so-called probabilistic pathfinding paper. Right? The title is a little bit different. It's like security and privacy on the Lightning Network with uncertain channel balances. But the key here is whenever I make a payment, I don't know how the liquidity is distributed in the channels that I'm going to use, right? So Kevin, if we two have a channel, I can easily send money to you on our channel if I know that I have the money. But if you have another channel, let's say with Andreas, and I want to send money to Andreas over your channel, I mean, I can offer you an HTLC and say, hey, can you please forward 1,000 or 100,000 Satoshis on your channel to Andreas? But what could happen is that you are telling me is, I just don't have that money on the channel with Andreas. Right? And then you're going to fail your onion and the payment fails, right? So what we did in this first paper is we expressed the likelihood for payments to settle on the Lightning Network. And when you do all the math theory, what you will very easily learn is, and it's very intuitively to many people, is the smaller the amount you send, the higher the likelihood is that it will settle. Right? And this is a huge motivation for people to say, hey, instead of sending the entire amount at once, let's just split it into several parts and then send it across different routes through the network, because each of the shards that we have has a higher chance of being successful. What people have been overlooking in the past, or kind of like not taking too seriously, was the observation that the more channels are involved in a payment, the likelihood of success also falls exponentially, right? So there's this sweet spot. If you have a certain payment size to a certain amount, like if you don't split it, your failure rate will be high. If you split it a little bit, the failure rate decreases. But if you split it too heavily, it increases again, right? So this entire thing is an optimization problem. Like there is this sweet spot of how you want to split it, right? And most implementations did initially a very, I would say, poor job in splitting payments. They would just basically say, hey, let's cut it in half, or let's cut it into 10 chunks of equal size, right? But if you want to split it optimally, you might have to send like one chunk that is a little bit larger over like larger channels and one chunk that is a little bit smaller, right? And this entire splitting problem is kind of a weird mathematical problem. And this is something that I was, kind of heavily working on in the beginning of last year.
Yeah. So you're trying to figure out basically like which, if you and I are trying to send a payment back and forth, and there's tens or hundreds of paths that we could potentially take around the network, the idea here is you're trying to figure out like which ones are the optimal paths to take, and should it be split up across many paths, or should it just be confined to a few, and figure out like exactly what the optimal route is. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. And I have to say, optimality obviously can mean different things, right? So for example, for you, optimality could mean the lowest fees, right? For me, at that time, optimality meant highest reliability, which is equivalent to highest chance for the payment to succeed. So I was maximizing the probability or reducing the uncertainty cost that is attached to like not knowing how the liquidity is being distributed. Right, and of course you can also combine these two goals, where you say, I want to find something that is optimal with respect to my objective, that is minimizing the uncertainty and minimizing the fees, right? Or you could also include something like latency, right? So there's obviously a choice to be made, right? But I was like literally studying this optimization problem, and while studying this optimization problem, like as I said, I was a mathematician. I was writing this down very formally. I already had it written down, but I couldn't solve it. Right? And I was basically reinventing this entire theory of minimum cost flows that was started to being invented like 60 years around at MIT. And then Stefan Richter came around, a good friend of mine, who understood the first paper about probabilistic pathfinding. And I was like, Stefan, I have this thing. I think this is working. I think this is optimal, but I cannot prove this. And I don't want to publish this if I cannot prove this. Like, can you give me some feedback? And he's looking at what I'm doing, and he's like, Rene, can you please stop being so dumb? And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, I'm paraphrasing him, right? Like, I mean, he might not have said this literally, but he's like, the stuff that you're doing, this must have been solved already. I'm like, I know. I tried to search for it in the literature. I didn't find anything. It turned out I used the wrong terms. And after a week or so, Stefan came back to me and he's like, hey, there's this thing called minimum cost flows. You should really look at this. So then we were basically like 1 month just reading a 1,000 pages book about minimum cost flows. And we were realizing everything that I was trying to like reinvent and prove was already solved by the people at MIT and some other universities. So then we could basically apply this entire theory of logistics and
And this minimum cost flow idea, this was outside of the Lightning Network, right? This is
totally
a separate field.
So this is in a field that is called operation research, and the older you get, the harder it is to be intimidated by certain things. But last week I was at MIT, and before I went to the website of the Operation Research Council, that's their department that is doing this, and I was just looking at this, and I was so intimidated. It's unbelievable. I mean. It's hardly known to people outside of math, but the min cost flow problem is, I would say, probably one of the mostly spread optimization mechanisms or solvers that we are using. So, for example, the entire COVID response that they did in the United States, they have was basically consulted by the MIT department there. Because there's a lot of logistics involved, like how do you move the vaccines, like how do you get this to certain spots, right? I think this entire field operation research came originally from military, where you also ask yourself, like, how do you do the logistics of getting certain things at certain places, right? So you can already feel it's very similar to Lightning, like how do you get your Satoshis from your node to another node, right? And you have a certain cost attached to each channel, and the cost, again, might be the fees, it might be the uncertainty, like whatever you model into this. Our observation in this paper was basically like, initially I thought I would solve a tiny problem of like splitting this optimally, right? But what turned out is that splitting this optimally leads actually to a huge improvement in the amounts that we can send over the Lightning Network. So I think last year everybody agreed, like, if you want to send 100,000 Satoshis or 200,000 Satoshis, that usually works. But as soon as the amounts get larger, like, you have really high failure rates. With my method, if I have a Lightning node that has a Bitcoin on it and somebody else has a Bitcoin of inbound liquidity, probably I can send it over the network.